So Jared came to us to do a presentation today. We know Jared from coming to both Governor's Island and to the parade. He's on active duty in Germany, so it's really nice that he's able to join us today. Jared, let me make the host.
Yeah, sure. All right. I'm now the host. All right. Hey, everybody. How's it going? My name's Jared Nichols here. I know many of you from in person. I've shared drinks and beverages with several of you as well. So it's good to see all your faces again. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the French influence on the AEF in World War I. It's something I've actually studied quite a bit on. My master's thesis was on the training of the AEF, and I did a comparison over the methodology between how the regular Army, the National Guard, and National Army were all trained and prepared for the war. And I finished that degree program last year. So the way this is I'm gonna kind of brief today. I'm gonna talk a little bit up front right now to you on screen. I'm gonna bring up a PowerPoint presentation with some photos. I have about 6 slides to show you of some pretty cool photos to talk through a little bit. And then after that, we're gonna do a little bit of show and tell. I have some items right here with you, and we're gonna talk a little bit about those sort of things that the Doughboys would have seen at the front as well. So first of all, I'm going to start off with which kind of a brief overall. So why do we talk about the French Army and the American Army? You know, post World War II, there's been a lot of, quite frankly, downplaying on French military experience. But for about 400 years, they were one of the most dominant land powers in Europe. And a lot of what the U.S. Army learned was from the French Army, going all the way back to the American Revolution and before. So if you follow trends in military history in the U.S. from 1775 up through about the 1870s, it was all French influence. For those of you that have done Civil War reenacting, every single time you bust open one of the manuals, Hardee's, Casey's, it's all almost direct pulls from French military manuals. And when you look at the World War I American manuals, not many things changed. They almost did the same thing again in the Great War once they actually got into the conflict. The influence of the French is kind of multifaceted. It's not just how to run a military, but it's also cultural. A lot of the United States, of course, is pulling fashion, music, and everything else from Paris, because Paris was really, at the time we talk about the Great Wars, in the Belle Epoque period. So it really is the great cultural foundation, the new Athens, for lack of a better term, for most of the world. So that's where all the culture's coming from. So every American had some sort of facet of French culture, whether it was women's fashion or the latest fad in movies or the latest comedy. That was all coming, a lot of it was coming from France at the time. So that's kind of where we kind of trace it from there. And at the dawn of the Great War, despite the French getting it handed to them in the 1970s in the Franco-Prussian War, you really see the French influence still expands. But then it starts to slacken as we hit the dawn of the 20th century, mainly because the United States, the military after the Civil War, is really just kind of a National Guard type organization, part-time soldiers, militia units, all the experience that the U.S. Army learned in the American Civil War was gone. And nobody was really taught anything. Most of the Civil War officers stayed well on into the Spanish-American War. And when those guys left, it's not like they taught anybody else. They pretty much took there wasn't schools to teach American service members. There wasn't, they didn't build big organizations and test out fighting a brigade or fighting a division. None of that happened. So when America enters the war, they're a consularary force. They've been trying to keep Indians on reservations. They're chasing down the Moros in the Philippines, and they're policing up, the rugged American West. And here we are in the greatest modern war, and the American Army is thrown into it. And those are some very hard lessons learned. And we're going to talk about some of these things. So some disclaimers up front right now. So for those of you that are giant John Pershing fans, I am not. So if you're looking for a giant defense of John Pershing as the greatest thing next to sliced bread, look somewhere else, please. We can discuss it. I do understand why people respect the man, but I will say that he probably did more harm than good. That's just my own humble opinion. The other part is you're going to get a particularly pro-French view. I am a little bit of a Francophile. A lot of it comes down to, I used to think of myself as an Anglophile, and as I read more about the Great War, and as I read more about the Doughboys' experience in the Great War, you definitely see that they were not treated well by a lot of the British Army. So therefore, the average soldier felt that they were more in line with the French army. It's kind of where my beliefs are. So right now, I'm going to kind of pop open the brief here. I'll pull it up for everybody, and then I'll do a share screen. You guys will be able to see it as well. So just bear with me because it's PowerPoint and it's evil. See, share screen. All right, you have to let me know if you can or cannot see anything. Can you guys actually see the PowerPoint presentation? Okay, good deal.
Yep.
All right, so we'll start off with the first slide here. So it's kind of showing some doughboys there and some French soldiers right there. Sometimes you have to look really close because they're covered in mud and they're kind of hard to tell apart. The first slide here, so we talked a little bit about the French influence prior to the United States entry into the war. So this is kind of showing you a photo of some of those soldiers that were actually working in or serving in the French army or working in the French army prior to the United States entry into the war. And a lot of these Americans that went overseas to serve prior to the America's formal entry in the late 1916, 1917, these guys were immensely popular for the stories they told and for the articles in newspapers extolling their exploits. So to kind of show you an example of some of those experiences, people we have right here in the upper left, you see the much vaunted American Ambulance Service or American Field Service. Bottom left, you'll see the Lafayette Escadrille, which is a couple of their pet lions. Up in the right, you'll see Eugene Bullard, the first American or African American ace. Right there. And the bottom right, some people may or may not know it, but there was a number of Americans that went and served in the French Foreign Legion as well. You'll see right down there, Seeger is a very famous writer and poet, and some of his comrades. That's actually a photo of Americans serving in the French Foreign Legion. These guys were all immensely popular, and so when we talk about the cultural influence, when you read kind of like the dime novels and the newspaper headlines, this is what people were reading and consuming in 1914 and 1915. And this also, the idea that Americans were going to support the only other democracy fighting in the world kind of helped reinforce democratic principles. Where they believe in liberty, we believe in liberty. They believe in freedom, we believe in freedom. A lot of people were drawing these parallels before the American formal entry. So you find that while in 1914 it was hard to get, the giant German-American cluster or Irish-American cluster to truly commit to this war, a lot of these stories really start to win people over, and especially as they start to popularize the German, the submarine attacks, this also helps turn American opinions on the war. So this finally, we finally see the United States finally commit, and so now we have this informal influence through culture, through media, and now we finally see the formal influence. So like we discussed before, the United States isn't really ready for the war. They're not really trained for the war. They've been chasing Pancho Villa on the frontier, being marched in circles, trying to still fight a battle like the Civil War. And they're not necessarily ready for the conflict per se. So what you'll see is the French army, more so than the British, expend tremendous effort in trying to train the United States Army. Now, Pershing, of course, is legendary for wanting to have a quote-unquote American army. Now, this American army, nobody can ever really explain what that meant other than Americans working for Americans and General Pershing being in charge of it. But outside of that, they didn't really have a formalized doctrine. They didn't necessarily have the know-how of how to build entrenchments, how to use weapons, how to kind of tie in all these different weapons into what we call combined arms maneuver, which is I'm using my rifles, my machine guns, my mortars, my artillery, my aircraft, everything is reinforcing my attack. Now, going into 1916, the American army is still trying to fight like the 1914 armies did. They're trying to just do the frontal assault, which is still, unfortunately, very much influenced by the French because the American officers had read the same stuff. The big theorists are called Dupict, Malmaison, and even Joffre himself were all these massive fans of the frontal assault. The American army hadn't really changed. And when you hear the term open warfare kind of thrown around in a lot of what you're reading, that's what they kind of mean. Get up and out of the trenches and just run at them, and our gusto and the American rifleman is going to win the day. To give you an example, in the U.S. Army's training to bring a new soldier in and prepare them for the Western Front is about 600 hours of instruction. The majority of that instruction was rifle marksmanship and drill and ceremony, which totaled almost 300 hours. only about 15 hours were dedicated to trench warfare. So I always found that as kind of an interesting fact. So if you followed the training doctrine and just looking at Pershing said, that's the sort of what you would follow. But these French trainers were there, and a lot of units used them. So you're going to see right here in this photo, it's kind of interesting, some photos from here. So in the upper left-hand corner, you have some chasseurs, and in the background, those are cadets of the United States Military Academy. So this is actually a training detachment that was sent up to the United States Military Academy to help train the officers up there, soon-to-be officers. The upper right, this is actually a French 75 gun and a training instructor on the campus of Yale University training that detachment of cadet officers. And the middle photo is actually one of my favorites. This is on the campus of Princeton University, and this is a French colonel screaming at a bunch of Princeton students on how to build trenches and barbed wire. So I kind of get a kick out of that. And the bottom left, the American Army didn't know how to use all the new technologies of warfare. So machine guns, flamethrowers, things of that like. So here's actually a French instructor walking behind an American engineer, showing him how to use a flamethrower. And your bottom right, those are actually French chasseurs showing how to sandbag a trench line by lying on your back. And you can barely see the leggings of some US Marines in that same photo. They're literally standing over them and getting the block of instruction. And a lot of what the American doughboys really liked about the French Army is when they did the instruction, they got dirty too. They felt more at ease with the sort of French officer class as well, because in the French Army, it wasn't based upon your lordship, your princeship. It was really based upon, did you serve in the regular army? How many years did you serve? And they truly believed that, you know, those that had served should be those ones that get higher rank. And that, you know, the colonel of the battalion shouldn't be the third viscount of so-and-so that pays for their command. So that's kind of the reason why the Americans kind of felt, a little bit of more akin to the way the French Army was built, because they kind of felt the American Army was the same way. So we finally talk about two topics that are kind of interesting. First, a lot of American units rotated underneath the French Army to learn how to fight at the front when they first initially got overseas. This is kind of like a bloodening to go to a quiet sector, learn a little bit about trench warfare, and pretty much ask questions with French advisors. So typically an American battalion would be intermixed with a French regiment. And then after a period of about 30 days over there, they rotate back to the rear, get some more training for some of these large training camps. Gondrecourt is probably one of the largest training camps that most units pass through. And there they actually would go through all their basic, how to use the weapons, break them down, fire them, employ tactics, and then really try to learn about fire and maneuver, employing artillery, which was the key. The French were kind of shocked that a lot of the American artillerists didn't understand like math or anything like that. So that was kind of a frustration because a lot of our soldiers weren't necessarily academically prepared for how technological war had gotten at this time. So there were some that served a little bit, but there's also some units that spent their entire experience fighting in the French Army. So I'd like to mention the 93rd Division for one. The 93rd Division, the African American Division, was handed by Pershing over to the French Army, mainly because he didn't want them serving along white soldiers, and it might cause problems in the rear. The 93rd Division is absolutely fascinating because, as you can see from the photos here, they're just a hybrid of American doughboy uniforms and French Poilu uniforms. So if you notice on the uniform right there in the upper left, he's wearing, a hybrid of both. He has French canteen, a French haversack. He's wearing the ammunition he's carrying, a French Derriere rifle, a French gas mask as well. And this is the way, the vaunted Harlem Hellfighters, this is roughly what the Harlem Hellfighters would look like in combat, despite what you would see from media-related photos of them kind of dressed more like doughboys, which were taken more for public consumption. And one of the things that Pershing also passed was he handed these units to the French Army and told them, well, you need the laws of the United States apply here in France, so you need to make sure the laws of Jim Crow apply here in France. Well, the French threw that right out the window because if there's one thing you learn about the French Army, everybody is going to be equally treated poorly. So the 93rd Division received all the same benefits as your regular French troops. Were able to go to cafes with whites. They were able to go to brothels with whites. They were able to frequent the rear areas and walk around the streets. Their officers were saluted the same way that white officers were saluted, which wouldn't necessarily be the case in the rear areas of the AEF. This experience kind of really wears off, and on the Harlem Hellfighters and the other units of the 93rd Division, so much so that by the end of the war, a lot of these men actually emigrate back to France and actually settle down in Paris because they don't feel necessarily the United States isn't so forgiving of their ethnicity when they return. One of the final, if you look at this photo on the right-hand side, that's the 369th Harlem Hellfighters parading through Manhattan. Because they weren't allowed to march with the 42nd Division in the Victory Parade, because according to the leadership of the 42nd Division, black is not a color in the rainbow. They decided to do their own parade, and here they're actually marching through the middle of Manhattan in French formation, surprisingly, not American-style formation. So this is kind of like the final to the American army that, hey, look, these guys are accepting of us. Look how they were treated. We're more French than we probably are American at this point. Which kind of gets us to this point. When we just talk about what we're getting to next, just some of the ephemera, because the American army wasn't necessarily ready for the conflict they were stepping into, a lot of the equipment issued to the doughboys was from the French army. So let's look at this photo particularly. In the upper left, we see French M2 gas masks. You'll see in the center of the photo, doughboys wearing Adrian helmets. You'll also see a photo at the bottom left. Those are Marines, and they're actually slung over their shoulders, French haversacks, as well as the French M2 masks. And on the right-hand side, you'll just see some different pieces of French military equipment as far as tanks, machine guns, and the 37mm cannon. And of course, the shosha. Most of these were items that the U.S. industrial bases couldn't produce at the time. So whether you were a huge fan of the French or you liked their technology, you were going to learn how to use it. So the doughboys themselves were influenced throughout the war by their experience in the French army. Their leadership was influenced by the French army, and then also large portions of them served in the French army, which kind of leads us to like our last point right here. You know, this kind of fraternity they felt the French army couldn't be more defined than kind of looking at some of these photos from either just in combat or just out of combat. This is kind of the side that the doughboys felt the most in line with because they definitely felt that these were more like them. Even though they might speak a different language, the feeling was a little bit more there than they might be with other allies. All right, I'm going to try to drop out of this view right here and back to my camera. All right, can you guys just see me now?
No.
No? Okay, do I need to stop my share? Is that how that works there?
Stop your share.
Yeah, we can see your desktop. Okay. We can't see.
There we go. See me now?
Yes.
Okay. Too easy. All right, so you got me full screen now? Yes, yeah, that thumbs up. Okay, too easy. All right, so what we're going to do really quick right now is I'm going to kind of just show you some pieces of equipment that have been very, very familiar with doughboys, and a lot of them would have carried. You'll especially find with the units that first arrived, like the 1st and 2nd Division and the 42nd Division, they spent a lot of time in the French Army. They picked up a lot of equipment from the French Army, whether it was through official means or not. You'll actually find that the 1st Division actually issued orders that ordered all the men to turn in their 1-quart canteens or 2-quart canteens so they could actually be issued the French 2-liter bidon canteen. So you'll actually find, you look in photos for this weird outline right here. All right, this is the outline you're looking for a lot of those photos because this 2-liter bidon was very, very, very popular among the AF, mainly because it's easy to consume. And if you've ever had to pull a canteen out of those little pouches on the back of your uniform, it's very hard to take out and it's very easy to lose. Whereas this is pretty easy to strap around yourself. So these typically came in 2 varieties, and this is one of the most popular pieces of gear that you would have seen a doughboy use. Usually 2 different colors based upon what depot it was drawn from. So you have it in horizon blue as well as with the colonial moutarde. So you would have seen, again, both intermixed. At one point going into the Meuse Argonne, the entire 1st Division was carrying the canteens, the 2-liter canteens. Again, very popular. The later National Army units weren't as lucky because they had less opportunity to pick up stuff. You hear stories about the 1st and 2nd Division. They were just picking up battlefield rubbish wherever. So you might have a squad, instead of having a shosha, they might try to carry 3 shosha because they just were able to pick them up and take them with them. One of the other more ubiquitous sort of items you would have seen would have been, everybody is very, very familiar with the American overseas cap. All right, the American overseas cap is directly influenced by the French. So this by itself was much easier to carry, of course, than the Montana Peak cap. This is pulled right from the French culot. Now, this is the roughly the late 1890s style culot. This is actually based off an earlier version from the Napoleonic era. This is called the Imperial Cap. So this was in fashion at the time, and so you'll find a lot of these caps have the same sort of profile because it looks kind of like the French one. But by about 1918, a new fashion, like French fashion does, French fashion changes, the Imperial Peak Cap came back in style. So you'll see a lot of doughboys wearing this one. It's pretty easy to tell because when it's worn on the head, it has the front and the aft peaks. So you'll see this a lot in the doughboy photos. Of course, they'll have it in a khaki color, but look for the profiles. This would have been probably made by someone in France for a doughboy. So that's another item we'd have found a lot of. Some other items as well. We've already mentioned the French Adrian helmet, probably the most popular helmet used in the war because the French made a lot of them and they supplied a lot of countries with them. So Russia, Serbia, Italy, and the United States. And you'll even find the Harlem Hellfighters, based upon what depot they went into, they either drew one that was colored blue or colored the khaki color as well. So again, 2 items you would have found doughboys wear or at least bring home at the end of the war. One of the most popular items probably carried, and we mentioned it a couple weeks ago, was the M2 gas mask. Again, when you look at a photo of a doughboy, you'll see these slung around them because if you've ever worn an ARS mask, they are garbage if you're trying to do any sort of work detail. Usually the rule in the zone of the armies was you have to have a gas mask at all times. Well, if nobody's really telling you exactly what that means, you can carry a little pouch like this and it's a lot lighter, easier to sling off the hip. It of course carries the M2 gas mask right there. Really easy to carry, really easy to put on. Usually has to be soaked in some sort of material to actually work. But again, a lot easier to carry around when you're in a rear area. And typically the ARS masks will go into the forward units and you can get away with this if you're in service supply. This is, again, when you look at profiles of doughboys, this is the can it was carried in. Also very popular if you have one of these to put your letters and then other personal items in. You'd have found these M2 cans pretty commonly as well, tucked away or worn off a belt loop. Another item that was extremely popular, the French Haversack. The U.S. Army wasn't issuing haversacks like they had been since the American Revolution, and this is a lot easier to carry something like grenades in. So you'll see a lot of photos with doughboys with these double slung off of their front, jam-packed full of grenades, because these are easy to carry. You can tuck them away when you don't need it. You can carry it around, use it later. But this is a great piece of kit to have on you if you need it. And it's also, because it's off the hip, you can grab your snacks and be on the go. And for those of you who have messed with the blanket roll before, it's terrible if you're actually in combat and you need something quickly to use. Some of the other items, again, we'll get back to some French influence as well. First of all, we'll talk a little bit. Identity tags right here. This is a French identity bracelet worn on the wrist. Again, became very popular with doughboys because as a fashion item, they saw the Poilus wearing them and wanted a little bit of extra identification. So you'll see a lot of these also on the wrists of doughboys as well. Another item that's very popular to wear on the kepi, they have these little kepi numbers right here, and you can put them together. They're gilt. They kind of have they kind of look like Civil War lettering. You see a lot of the times these be popped onto the front of kepis and stuff like that, just out of unit pride. Another thing that the Americans pull from the French and their exposure to the British is most of the American Army doesn't have history. Most of these units are formed out of nothing. So to have some sort of esprit de corps unit pride, they start incorporating what they see from the other allies and kind of tacking them onto the uniform. If you look at the uniform at the beginning of the war, there's really nothing on it. It's plain Jane. But by the end of the war, we see different units coming up with these different patches to put on because they look at the British wearing patches, the French wearing patches. It's flashy. They know their units. And so they start inspiring from that. A great inspiration would be these overseas service stripes right here, which again are worn on the U.S. Army uniform to this day for overseas service. The French issued these and they were actually in dark blue or based on your branch of service. They were worn inversely by the French, and this did not mean there was a French NCO. This meant this was somebody who'd served in this case, 18 months in the trenches, one stripe for every 6 months at the front. And the Americans start to do the exact same thing, except they start wearing them down on their uniforms as well. So this ends up being, again, directly influenced by the French as well. And it gets super confusing because they're just made by whoever, different materials. So you'll see these a lot, and that's a lot what they're inspired from. Another thing that's worn a lot, you'll see, the French army was crazy about these little brassards right here, because the French army would issue these different devices out to denote your job on the battlefield, so you knew exactly who to talk to about an issue. So you knew someone was a runner if they were wearing a correct colored brassard, like the color green. You knew someone was in the service of supply if they were wearing this brown brassard with this metal plate. This means that this person could go and come to the front, deliver supplies, and then not be held up or questioned because they're wearing the correct colored thing. And the AF incorporated the same system. They had all sorts of brassards for service of supply, runners, stretcher bearers, and they incorporated the same system. Another thing that lasts to this day would also just be awards. So everybody's pretty familiar with the Croix de Guerre, all right? I can blame the French for the U.S. Army's obsession with giving away ribbons. It all ties back to this period. To this day, the U.S. Army starts to look more like Panamanian generals, more so than it looks like service at the time of World War I. The U.S. Army didn't really do really awards in the sense we think of them today. It really starts because the French are giving out little pieces of ribbon, and Napoleon's was his great saying about a man will do more for a little piece of ribbon than anything else. So it starts there, and so you'll start to see now as we go that now the U.S. Army has ribbons on ribbons on ribbons and more awards, you know, about people's personal accomplishments. One thing that units still wear to this day is the fourragère. So this is a World War I style fourragère. And U.S. servicemen were being, or their units were being awarded these. If your unit served well in combat, the French Army would come out, they would do an award ceremony. Your unit would be awarded a fourragère on the unit flag, and then after the war, and at the end of the war, it became very popular also wear these on their uniform to denote that you were in a meritorious unit, as well as wearing your award for your own personal meritorious act. Now, U.S. Units in the Marine Corps and the United States Army still wear these to this day. Even though you weren't in the unit at the time, you would still wear one of these. I believe the 5th Marines still wear them, the 16th Infantry Regiment still wear them for their service in World War I to this day. So to kind of end it right there, to reiterate, the French Army has a massive influence throughout the course of history on the American Army. World War I is really the peak of that experience. And we can see the effects of it even to this day, whether it's, if you look at a unit crest, most of the unit crests have some sort of French influence in them. If you look at the unit awards, there's that influence as well. And also, if you really want to get into the basic MTO of a rifle squad, it's based on today, the modern MTO of a rifle squad is based upon the 1918 French MTO, Military Table of Organization and Equipment, of a French squad from 1918. So history just kind of repeats itself in many ways. And with that, open it up to questions, and hopefully I wasn't too far over time.
That was outstanding. Kudos. Anybody have any questions? That was really great, Darren.
That was cool. Very cool.
My first is, how did you get into studying the French? What drew you to that?
Well, let's see. Studying French, it kind of started, I was doing a lot of World War I reading, and I kept on circling back to certain things. A lot of it has to do with, like, I'm very fascinated with how the AAF was created. I mean, it's a miracle that the thing ever existed or was ever employed or ever ended up on a battlefield. So it's kind of fascinating to read about that process. And then over time, when you read about the accounts of the servicemen and their experience over there in France, it kind of echoes back to that, this being a defining moment in a lot of Americans' lives. This is the first time the United States Army had ever deployed a force this big, and to just kind of tear apart and figure out, how is this even done? I mean, today we talk about the U.S. military. It goes all over the world. It's not a big deal. At the time, this just wasn't done. And it's kind of everything kind of starts at this point with how the United States military is employed in the current modern age. And so that's why I'm kind of very fascinated about how they learned to do it and how they were influenced.
And Mario wants to know what's down with Pershing.
What's down with Pershing? So a couple things with Pershing. So Pershing looks the part, honestly. That's a lot of it. But he actually rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. The big problem was his firing of officers. So if you didn't listen to John Pershing, you would be fired. It didn't matter if your men liked you, if you were inspiring. If John Pershing didn't like you, you were fired. So he got rid of, he pretty much started his own groupthink system of people that were in his inner circle that only thought like him, reinforced his ideas. Another problem, Pershing never actually went to the front to see it with his own eyes. He never actually really got to see what the doughboys were experiencing, to understand why frontline leaders were like, hey, this open warfare idea is crazy. We can't just rise up all at one time. I should not charge forward without artillery support. And multiple times, John Pershing was making 1914 mistakes in 1918. And for me, that's unacceptable. The lessons have been learned by all sides at this point, and to fail to learn anything from those lessons is just American exceptionalism in extremis. Yeah, and it's like other people said, if you're over a certain age, you were fired. If you didn't look a certain way, you're fired. If you weren't a classmate with John Pershing, you were fired. So again, he kind of tore apart really the AAF and got rid of a lot of good soldiers, got a lot of good leaders in that case. The only people that were really effective were those his former classmates that told him to brush off and wouldn't listen to him at all. And a lot of the units that didn't listen to Pershing or just told their leadership to don't listen to what he said, I'll handle this. Those are the units that actually did relatively well on the Western Front. The 1st Division, the 2nd Division, they just wouldn't listen to Pershing and they just did their own thing. Yeah, and MacArthur's is just a sycophant for the person that posted that.
I want to bring on Don, because Don gave us a drink to make that was pretty popular last week.
Yeah, people seem to like it, and I've got a for all. Oh, can you guys hear me? Okay. One thing I want to do is it's spotlighted. Okay. Very cool. Let me reposition this a little bit so you can see my setup here. And then if you haven't muted yourself, would you mind muting yourself, because there's been a lot of background chatter and feedback, and I want to get rid of that. I want to stick to basically cocktails that people would have been drinking from 1914 to 1918, or cocktails inspired by that. And that's what we're going to do today. Somebody coughing?
Hey, Tim.
Anyway, first, quick little bit of trivia. I'm hearing a lot of noises. Somebody's banging something around. No? Okay. So what do we have? We've got, little trivia. What part of women's fashion from the Victorian era became men's fashion in the 20th century? And I know it's more of a rhetorical thing since you're muted. The fedora. So Fedora was a French play from 1882 starring Sarah Bernhardt, and in her character, Princess Fedora Romanzov wore a felt hat that became very popular with ladies in the Victorian era. And then, the play was first performed in the US in 1889. This is going to be important because, yes, the hat became popular fashion for men and women, but this book, Harry Johnson's Bartender Guide from 1888, we've got the Fedora cocktail. So it's right there. And I'm going to be making a variation of that today for you guys. Now, this book is actually a reproduction from Cocktail Kingdom. So is the next one I'm going to show you. But what we've got here is from the recipe. I'll just read it for you in case you want to make this. It says, use in a large bar glass, 1 pony of brandy, 1 pony of Curacao, 1 pony of Jamaican rum, 1 pony of bourbon, 1 tablespoon of powdered sugar dissolved in a little water, 1 slice of lemon. Fill the tumbler with fine ice, shake well, and ornament with berries or small pieces of orange. Serve with a straw. Now that's a very, very ornate cocktail, and that's how they would have made it back in the 1800s. Then recipe changed. We've got Modern American Drinks by George J. Kepler. And I asked about a pony. You see the chat here. Yes, a pony, which we can, well, here's the thing, is equivalent today, you could call it, I guess, like a jigger. I forget what the exact dimensions are of the 1800s pony. Jiggers have changed too, which are between like 1.25 ounces to 1.5 ounces. and I modernized the cocktail. Well, you'll see soon what we're going to have. This is the Fedora Punch right there from this book, Modern American Drinks. And this was from 1906. So people in the early 1900s would have been drinking this. This has an ounce of brandy, ½ ounce of Curacao, an ounce of bourbon, juice of half a lemon, which is, lemons were smaller then, about this size. So it's about ½ to 1 ounce of lemon, tablespoon of sugar, shake well, serve in a long thin punch glass, trim with fruit, sip with straws. And if you look at the two different recipes, you see this has half the amount of Curacao in this recipe in the 1906 as opposed to the Victorian one. And it doubles the brandy and it adds lemon juice. So, and it does not specify the rum. Oh, we got more, okay, good. So this is what people would have been drinking earlier. Now, one of the reasons why I really wanted to pick the Fedora was because, let me see if I can share something with you. This book, 70 recipes for cocktails, cups, and punches, collected and compiled by GGD and EEFP, sold in aid of the Red Cross at Johor Arde Fet 1917. I have not been able to find this. If somebody, I'm putting this up there because if you happen to see one, please get it for me. I would love to have it. Where I found it, let me get out of this. Wait, how do you, can everybody see that? Yeah, okay.
See it.
Great, I'm just trying to get out of it now. Okay, great. The reason, there we go. So that was sold somewhere either in the UK or in Europe, because in the beginning of it, they mention that it's from our friends across, the Atlantic, which means that, it's not an American thing. So I'm trying to track it down. Sold in aid of the Red Cross in 1917. And I got that from going to a website, which I recommend, the Exposition Universelle des Vins et Spiritueux, where the Universal Exposition of Wines and Spirits, where they have a ton of cocktail books from the Victorian age up through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, online for free, and you could just page through them virtually. So what we're going to do then is make the 1917 recipe. So it calls for 1 liquor glass of brandy. I'm going to do 1 ounce. So what you can use for your brandy, I mean, I would use brandy. I don't happen to have just brandy, so I'm going to just use cognac. It's a higher end brandy from the region of Cognac, and we'll see how that goes. A little splash. Oh, you scoot over this way to the light. Okay, so we've got 1 liquor glass of brandy, 1 liquor glass of Curacao, and I'll put this up here so people can see it now. Now this is dry Curacao. Curacao is a bitter orange liqueur, originally made by the Dutch from Seville oranges that are a kind of Seville orange, which is unique to the island of Curacao. The Dutch way of doing it would have been very neutral spirit or grain spirit, I believe. And the French version of their Curacao is with a brandy or eau de vie base, which is what this has. I think Bowls might, I'm not sure if they do an original or not. Basically, dry Curacao means that it is a sec. Sec means dry. If you use more than 1 type of orange, you can have like triple orange. It's a triple. So a triple sec means it's orange, multiple oranges, and it's very dry. So next thing we have here is Jamaican rum. Now I've got 2 kinds of Jamaican rum here. I've been doing some research, and the rum that they would have had back then would have been a little funkier, but they were also making some that were a little more neutral. So this is a very funky rum, which I recommend. It's just a standard Jamaican rum, and it's 100 proof. proofs were a little bit higher back then. So is this. This is a white rum, Ray and Nephew. They could have been using this back then as well. So I'm going to use this. Either will work. It depends on how funky you want the rum. If you want it really, really funky, I'd recommend something like this or Hamilton. So already we've got an ounce of brandy, ounce of curacao, an ounce of rum. Now what we're going to do is an ounce of rye whiskey. If you want to use the earlier recipes, I'd recommend, but which they call for bourbon, I'd recommend something like Old Grandad. It's 100 proof, higher proof, bonded. What we're going to do, because this recipe calls for rye, I'm sorry, half an ounce of rum, which is what I poured in there. So 1 ounce brandy, 1 ounce curacao, half an ounce of rum, and half an ounce of rye. This Old Overholt, it's straight rye whiskey, bonded, also I believe 100 proof. So half an ounce of that. Now, here's what comes, it's very interesting. It says 1 tablespoon of sugar and a slice of lemon mixed in a shaker. So I've made some simple syrup, which is half water simmered with half sugar, so equal amounts. Oh, somebody's got a question here on chat. Oh, nothing new. Okay, good. Sorry. So then, slice of lemon. Got lemon here. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do here is actually I'm going to put the lemon straight into there. Grab our ice. The reason I'm doing it this way, I'll show you. Shake it. Now, you'll see that this recipe is basically the same as the original 1888 recipe, except now the whiskey's rye. But what I'm going to do, you could either fill this with fresh ice and then strain it, or one of the things that they did back then was just dump the whole thing in, top with a little more ice, garnish it, and then serve with a straw. So that's basically your 1917 Fedora that you would have found, you know, basically anywhere that had the American Red Cross book. So that's it. So cheers to everybody, and thanks for listening.
Don, can you post that recipe to page? We want to be able to share that.
Yeah, absolutely. I could post all 3 of them. Yeah.
That's really great.
Oh, it's really tasty too. Yeah.
Anybody have any questions? I'm ready to start making a cocktail. Did anybody bring anything to show and tell today? I see Todd Rambo looking around his house, going back and forth.
I got a few things.
All right, let's see. I think Tom held his hand up first. What you got, Tom?
So I have it's not World War I, but it's a 1920s landing force manual, and I'm waiting for the 1918 edition to come in. I just ordered it a few days ago as kind of a celebratory I'm out of the museum business book.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I got one there, Kevin. So this is recently acquired. This is a painted, doughboy helmet right here, the old Brody helmet. But it's really kind of cool because you kind of see the original paint on it. You can sign it. It still has the liner on top of it. So this is actually a pretty decent find. That's not all painted up for a victory parade or sit around the house.
That's cool.
That's very cool.
I was going to say, Kevin, the only thing I brought out that was French, given with the theme, was a pre-war, probably up to 1914,
Kepi officers, which is, I think, lieutenant, cap, 3 bars. What is that?
I think that's captain.
Captain? It's something like that.
Yeah.
Really nice early war. It's got the lighting is pretty terrible here, but it was still not terribly stiff. It's got the inside of the cap rolled to the center.
Can you hold it up again? So if you actually look at that, the top of the cap, that's a lot of what inspired. Have you ever seen the officer braid on the doughboy overcoats or whatever? That's of that exact pattern. That goes all the way back to French inspiration that we use that endured throughout that entire period as well.
Yeah, so the American version of that you see commonly is the officers' overcoats. They've got the quarter foil on the cuff of the overcoat, and it's really ubiquitous. The place where you see it still today is Marine Corps officers' caps. They still have that same sort of, not exactly the same pattern, but the same idea. They've got the quarter foil on the top of their cap.
Yeah, the U.S. Army still has it on the mess dress uniforms, the short jacket dinner uniforms.
Okay.
So it's on the cuff, but it's funny because it's only one looping, so it's technically only like a lieutenant, but you'll have a general wearing that with their rank on that.
Right.
That's the only thing that survived.
Yeah, and to Jared's point about the rank is that earlier on, up until World War I and probably after, if you were a second lieutenant, I don't think you got any ribbons. But full lieutenant, you get one row. Captain, you get 2 rows, and so on and so forth. Until you were like a colonel, you'd have half a dozen rows of braid on your cup, and it was really a resplendent looking piece of uniform that you would have that, as Jared mentioned, has been reduced, a little bit more simplified. It's been reduced to, I think, 1 row of braid to just about everybody. General officers are different, but they were different back then too.
Cool, thanks,
I'm
Todd.
sorry, I think the most important thing we are seeing here is, Todd, do you have hair on your chin?
I do. I haven't shaved in about a month.
It's real weird. It's real weird, I guess.
Now you know why I
It took him
never
a
tried
month
to
to grow
grow
that.
any hair on my face.
I got one thing to show you guys. Have you heard of this guy, Pat O'Brien, in his book, Outwitting the Hun? He was a pilot flying with the Royal Air Force, who was captured, and he escaped a German POW camp and got back to friendly lines and actually met the king before he went back to the US. He came back as like a big hero. And then he wrote this book about his escape through Belgium and whatnot. The US Army wouldn't take him back in. So he kind of spent the rest of his life like doing vaudeville speaking engagements, talking about how he escaped the Germans. It's a great read. It'd be a really good movie. It was going to be an episode of Mysteries at the Museum, and they contacted me, and I don't know how they're going to reenact that one poorly, but it's a cool read though.
I'm actually looking on eBay. I'm waiting for a book to come down in price, and it's letters from French mothers to American mothers at the end of the war. And there's another book that I'm looking at that deals again with women and how they were kind of dealing with it, and a few pins that were Children's Day of children of orphans, they've become orphans because of their fathers, and how that's kind of, because of Mother's Day coming up, there's a bunch of Mother's Day cards from that time period, which are really beautiful. They're silk and they're embroidered. So it's just kind of something that I've been looking into online. And the
There's a big effort after the war to allow families to come to Europe to the cemeteries where their sons are interned, and there was a number of guest homes that were built across the battlefields of the Meuse-Argonne. So you can actually, the buildings still exist. They're actually built purpose-made to be temporary hotels for widows to come back, and they typically widows, mothers, and they typically would the French village would host the families, and they would link up those that had lost on the French side, those lost the American side, and spend time with each other. So the 20s and 30s are a really fascinating time about how, if you talk about battlefield tourism, that's kind of like kind of what it was at the time. But yeah, if you go right around Verdun, you'll see buildings that just had like a 77th Division crest or a 27th Division crest on it, because they were the hotel buildings for that purpose.
Cool.
Yeah, we've had some neat stuff in the DuPont family collections about that, because they took a trip there after the Great War and ended up adopting a couple of kids remotely, you know, so it's pretty neat to see how some Americans got involved in all that as well.
Cool.
Cool.
Anybody else have any good stuff to show off?
Yeah, I picked up nothing exciting, but I picked up another helmet too. And this is it's a British shell, and it's kind of cool, hard to see in this light. It's got probably about half of the surface on it. Someone's painted it silver. I'm kind of looking forward to trying to restore this. It's got that really heavy sand surface on it. I assume that since it's got a rim on it, it's probably one of the later ones, the 1916 and later model. I need to look at, I haven't looked at the heat stamp to try to figure out what the exact date on this thing is. But anyhow, there it is. Kind of cool.
Thanks, Brian. That's really nice.
Future Marine stuff.
I was going to say for anybody who was interested in what the American full dress uniforms that incorporated that quarter formula looked like, besides just the overcoats, this was a lieutenant's full dress uniform, and again you can see where it would be on the cuff. Coast Artillery. Yeah, so that's Coast Artillery. And the uniform itself is a rather resplendent uniform in comparison to what was in regulation in 1917. A lot of the stuff went away as soon as they realized that, yeah, we don't really need to require people to buy all this really fancy uniform. Of course, the U.S. traditional blue uniform for everybody kind of gone away by that point. By 1902, they'd gone to olive drab for both cotton summer uniform and the wool uniform. So, but prior to 1917, that's what you would have seen on officers. And depending upon what your rank was, you would see different numbers of grade for your rank. So
Cool.
I always love blowing the mind of Marine officers when I always tell them about the quatrefoil on their covers, how, you know, the old wives' tale is that it came from the War of 1812 when officers put cord on their covers to keep the Marines and the fighting tops from shooting at them. Yeah. Where what they wore were the chapeaus, the fore and aft, you know, covers that couldn't take that design. And it always blows their mind when they learn that it was a French influence and everything too. So it's a good bar trivia that you can stump Marines with, which
they
is
that in boot camp.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a good point is, you would think about it, the U.S. Army in 1916, 1917 doesn't have any history. And if you're part of an organization, you want to feel like you're part of something. And when you show up and you have the 3rd Yeomanshire Yorkshire Regiment of Fusiliers has 3,000 years of history. And this unit's like, yeah, we've been together for 3 months and we've been rotated around and I don't know the guy next to me. All the doughboys were looking to belong to something, or at least to have that military tradition. And so they just kind of gravitated to different things they saw from the other allies. And so that's why you see a lot of that stuff pulled in, like the unit patches, the different insignia, all the other stuff that they hang off their uniform. So it's, you know, it's kind of a fascinating thing to collect or to even research.
I was going to say, Jared, one of the things I was going to try and find, which is buried somewhere, is a French overseas cap that's in the totally awful mutard, like mustard colored wool material that was actually used by the 116th Infantry, the U.S. Army 29th Division, that I have, that has those faux embroidered numerals that you'd mentioned earlier. And it's somewhere. I don't have it handy. But one of the things that you see a lot of the individuality that you're mentioning and wanting to belong in a given unit and have something to at least show that you are part of something is the overseas cap. And you see that a lot in the U.S. Army, is that just about every single variation, British, French, Belgian, American manufactured overseas cap, you see Americans using overseas, because this was a new piece of clothing, new article of equipment that wasn't part of the American Army anywhere prior. Yeah, exactly.
So you can't really see it that well in this one, but this is Private Ewing of the 372nd of the 9th Air Division. So he's got those faux embroidered numbers there, and he's wearing his Croix de Guerre right there on his coat.
Yeah.
So
precisely that. So then that's the same kind of cap that I have. That's original. They're cut very square, and so in your photo in that book, you see the corners of that cap poked in, so it doesn't quite look as bizarre and ridiculous as it does.
So what you'll see is that had only come into fashion in the French Army in 1918. So as the doughboys were showing up, that was the latest trend coming through the French Army, was the Imperial Style, which looks like the off-duty wear from Napoleonic times.
Right.
And so it's the French Army looking the Napoleonic era to have this fore and aft cap. And then the doughboys showing up and going, oh, that looks pretty cool. I want to have one. Can I get one? So that's why you see those weirdly. But that was only like a 1918 fashion thing. And then the French started embroidering stuff or adding stuff to it. Or the one I showed you guys had yellow piping for infantry. So they would go in and sew other stuff into it to, again, do the same thing. Like, I'm in the infantry, look at me sort of thing.
Yeah, and this is just what I have handy. But something you see later on in overseas caps, and you raise a really great point, is that the piping on overseas caps, you can't really see. This is really a dark blue for, I think, Judge Advocate or some weird branch. This is not normal. But the piping on overseas caps for officers is brought forward from the same situation. Infantry was a light blue, artillery was red, so on and so forth. The branch colors that we know now were definitely part of the ornamentation for overseas caps at that point. So there's as many different branch colors as there were branches in the U.S. Army at this point. So just as what Jared was saying, like this was a new piece of ornamentation that was not part of the American.
Even to your point, branch colors. This idea that every single job has its own specific color and that you put it on a uniform for piping. It had been around for a bit, but it gets out of control in World War I, where every single job specialty gets its own specific color with its own specific, like how many shades of red does the U.S. Army use? Because, I mean, the engineers use it, the field artillery use it, the coast artillery use a shade of red.
Don't forget ordnance.
Don't forget
crimson
ordnance.
Versus
has their own shade of red.
Crimson versus red.
Yeah. So this again, it's foundational to this period, and it's funny to watch it carry over now. Where you're just like, oh dear God, if you go back and like yell at the people today for the misery you deal with now, these are the people to yell at, were the people in charge of the AF.
Right. So this wasn't new. So back in 1902, there were and earlier, of course, there were branch colors. So this is that same artillery uniform. There's a branch color on the collar, right? But as Jared says, during World War I and definitely even just after, there's specific combinations of colors for machine gun battalions, gas, tank corps, you name it. If it's an organization that's reasonably distinct from any other, there is a specific color combination for it, and it's bonkers. There's just over the top. But again, that's to do with what Jed was saying, is wanting to show that your uniform was different than some other schmuck, which is interesting, you know.
Just be glad we didn't go with the ceremonial daggers.
Right. Yeah.
Anybody else have anything for this week?
I found a Navy hat, 5 cap in my size. I don't know if any of you can actually see it. I don't know if my video is showing up or not.
It looks good.
Yeah, I got the uniform is on its way that I'm hoping will also fit. I went to during the centennial, I was doing some public event, and a Navy vet walked up to me and asked me where the Navy people were, and I don't know anybody out here that does it, so I decided to pick up a uniform and try and do something about that.
We got some Navy folks here. We'll wrap it up. We'll have another get together next week, everybody.
Kevin, I'd like to quick interject here. I guess I noticed a question about the old granddad.
Sure.
Yes, actually, old granddad. I really like old granddad. A little trivia about that is that the guy